Hi, this is Dahlia Remler again. We're going to focus on qualitative research in this chapter, but this is not the only place in the course or in the book where we discuss qualitative research. In fact, we're going to interweave it through the rest of the book. So for example, when we talk about designing surveys, quantitative surveys that mostly measure categorical variables, we'll talk about how to use qualitative research to design that survey and to assess it. When we do randomized experiments, we'll talk again about how to use qualitative research at every stage of a randomized experiment, even though that's primarily a quantitative approach. So what is qualitative research? Well, first I want to just sort of say, well, kind of what's quantitative and what's qualitative? And there are some blurriness. Quantitative research, which you already know a bit about from statistics, uses quantitative measurements or numerical data. So those means numbers or categories. We call a category, even if it's not numerical, like say race, ethnicity, or gender, we call that a quantitative measure because you can count how many are in each category. In contrast, qualitative research involves a whole bunch of different kinds of non-numerical data, like text, words, phrases, so on, what people say, what they write, or images. It can be written language, but it can also be spoken language. Quantitative research typically, but not always, involves quote-unquote large N, meaning lots and lots of observations. Qualitative research typically means small n, few cases, few observations, and that's largely driven by how much work it is to basically analyze qualitative data, and we'll be seeing more about that. Quantitative research typically involves random sampling of some kind. You're trying to get a sample of a piece of a data set that is representative of a population. Not always, though. Qualitative research typically involves purposive or theoretical sampling, where you're not so much trying to get a data set that's representative of a population, but rather one that's designed to have contrasts and answer specific research questions. Quantitative research typically focuses on variables, what we spent a lot of time on in chapter 2. So focusing on, does a community have community policing? What are crime rates in a wide variety of communities? Focusing on the variables like community policing or crime rates. Qualitative research instead focuses on cases. Again, not always, but typically. So that would be not community policing and crime in lots of places, but hey, what happens in Portland? What happens in New York City? And getting a really holistic understanding of those cases. So qualitative research depends a lot on interpretation. By the way, so does quantitative research, and we'll be talking about that, but qualitative research kind of has interpretation at an earlier stage because the data are language, symbols, things like that. There's also an emphasis on intersubjectivity, trying to understand a concept or idea from someone else's perspective. And again, as I said, you often have purposive, or actually it's now more commonly called purposeful sampling. You have a specific research, a specific theory, you want to make particular contrasts. So think about an important issue or research topic in your field. What would be a quantitative study? Remembering that a quantitative study is going to give you numbers or categories. What would a qualitative study on the same topic look like? Do you know of studies where they mix qualitative and quantitative? So, pause the video for a second and think about that. Okay, so what are some advantages of qualitative research? Well, a big advantage is generating theories or building models. Remember, models are much more clearly specified versions of theories. And that's especially true when something's new or vaguely understood. In fact, whenever you want to learn about something and people don't know a lot about it, you almost always need to start with qualitative research. Also, and we'll be talking more about this and tying it into our Chapter 2 work in the group exercise, qualitative research is great for uncovering causal processes or mechanisms. So if we think that community policing or after school programs are going to change things, how would they do that? Why would they do that? Going in and getting inside people's heads or really deeply observing what's happening in qualitative research will help us. Qualitative research is also good where things are rapid, where time constraints don't permit other approaches. Although these days, with the ability to get quantitative data quickly off the web or do quick surveys, you can do quantitative research more quickly than you used to be able to. Qualitative research is particularly important when you care about important individuals or cases. The very large majority of research in history is qualitative. For understanding groups and group dynamics, for understanding culture, visual images, or texts. One major area of qualitative research starts with existing qualitative data. That means things like written documents that are already there, visual media, popular culture, the internet, photos, videos, media articles. The example we have in the book is tape recordings of 911 calls. Obviously, this has exploded. For those of you who are a little bit older like me, or even if you think back 10 years ago, think about how much more we have. All the YouTube videos, all the tweets, all the websites, just an enormous amount of existing qualitative data that can be analyzed. Another approach to gathering qualitative data is qualitative interviews, where the researcher interviews people, asking them questions. And these vary in how structured they are. They can be very, very unstructured with no predetermined set of questions. You have a very general time. Interviews can take place on many occasions over time. Ethnography is a technique. Trying to understand a culture that makes a lot of use of it. Often it can even seem like in an ordinary conversation, but it has important differences because you are trying to really increase general knowledge. Interviews can be more structured than that, semi-structured, the most common. A set of open-ended questions accompanied by probes that they're more in-depth interviews. They follow a semi-structured guide. So they're much more structured than what you'd see on a survey, even a survey that has one or two open-ended questions that are still qualitative. This is much more open-ended. In these qualitative interviews, you want to really not sort of push the interviewee. You want to let them speak. So you want to have these probing questions that are things like, say more about that. Explain that to me. Why is that important? What would be an example? What happened next? So again, you're letting them speak, but you're pushing to find out more. Of course, you want to do that pushing on the topics that you want to learn more about. You don't want to push on perhaps tangential things that the interviewee, the research subject, might have gone. Another approach is focus groups. People sometimes think of focus groups as, an efficient way to do interviews with lots of people all at once. That's a bad idea. Focus groups don't work well that way. They are small group discussions. They're led by a moderator, typically 6 to 12 participants seated around a table, but online focus groups are increasingly common even before the pandemic, and they should be smaller if they're online. The moderator asks questions and guides the discussion. A few important things about a focus group and when you should do a focus group versus not an individual interviewer. The participants cue each other. In the focus groups, you want them to react to each other. Focus groups are widely used to learn about subjects where social interaction is extremely important. So we want to learn, that's in politics, in marketing, in anything where what you want to learn about is heavily social and you really want to see the social interactions. So it mimics that social process of thinking about interviews. When you design the focus group and who's in it in the composition, you have to think a lot about those. Typically, you don't want people who already know each other. And you don't want people who will be frightened of each other, afraid to open up in front of each other. So you really have to think about that composition. People also like them. They feel that generalizability can be observed in the sense that you can get a certain amount of diversity within the focus group. But again, you need to be careful about that. There's also qualitative observation, directly observing a setting or behavior and taking notes or recording using photography or videos. That is, again, with the easier taking of video and audio recordings has become so much easier. There are obviously a lot of ethical questions. You're supposed to have informed consent for research. If something's completely public, do you need that consent? So there are a lot of issues. Can you think of some case of qualitative observation that would be useful for you in your field or in your job? What kind of qualitative observation would be informative? Qualitative observation also has a range that can include the researcher participating. And this is really a continuation. So in one end is what I was kind of talking about, where the researcher is just a complete observer, trying to remain unobtrusive, not doing interviewing, not engaging with people, totally observing. Then one up is the researcher visits as a participant, just one or two occasions. That might be observing a class, that, not being anonymous, sitting in on it, but, just a little bit. Then there's the participant as an observer. The researcher spends a lot of time in the setting. Doesn't assume a particular role when they're there. They get to know people and so on. And then finally, a complete participant. Researcher takes on a central role in the setting, gets to know people, maybe becomes a leader, or certainly a really active participant. Case study research isn't exactly a qualitative method because it's actually lots of qualitative methods, or at least two, often three, lots of methods which are often qualitative or often mostly qualitative, but are also quantitative. But the thing that makes it a case study is it's focused on a single, sometimes two in comparison, complex case. So again, that qualitative idea of going in depth in a case, that could be a person, but is much more typically an organization, a neighborhood, perhaps a country, something like that. And again, case study research usually uses more than one method to look at, no, it doesn't have to be, but it usually is more than one method to look at a case. They can all be qualitative, some of them can be quantitative. How do you select a case? Sometimes you want a typical case to have the greatest generalizability, but sometimes you want to study a particularly good or bad case, an extreme example, to try and get at, remember, the theory of why an organizations are particularly successful or unsuccessful. Sometimes you want a critical case that has unique importance just because we care about that case in and of itself. You do also have comparative case studies. So you're going in depth, but two or more cases, perhaps a really successful school and a really failing school. So when you get your qualitative data analysis through these kinds of methods, how do you analyze it? So there's a lot of prep to organize it, to summarize it, often through the process of coding. Coding means taking your qualitative data and basically summarizing it in the form of things that are categorical variables to some extent. Coding doesn't have to be used as categorical variables. It can also be thought of purely qualitatively. So in that 911 example, were the callers unreasonably polite? Were they making excuses? That's coding, summarizing what you see in each piece of qualitative data. When you have it, you can present it in narrative form, like quotes. If you have coded it into categorical variables, you can do a quantitative presentation with figures or tables. But when you do qualitative research, you shouldn't only present the codes in quantitative form. You need to do, again, things like quotes or images that show how they were quoted. That's extremely important. If you see a piece of qualitative research without that, you should be really suspicious. How are you going to know what they meant by an unreasonably polite 911 caller? Then you have to integrate it. The more interpretation, which we'll talk about. But before that, I want to make the point that a very valuable thing in qualitative research, unlike typically quantitative research, is that you integrate gathering the data and analyzing it. You don't just gather it all, and when you're totally done gathering your data, then you'll analyze it. Why? Because in qualitative data, you might change your questions. You might discover something about your theory, particularly when you're doing very explorative qualitative research. It might alter the questions you ask, or the probes you have, things like that. So you really don't want to wait. A colleague who's a qualitative researcher who works heavily with mostly quantitative research is constantly frustrated by the fact that they just want to wait till all the data is collected, and that's really represents a lost opportunity, that they could have had much better research if they had integrated it. So when you do want to analyze this, and this is part of the coding, but also after the coding, if you do coding, is you just want to sketch ideas, make notes, make memos, summarize. It's a less systematic thing. It's a fairly brainstorming thing. Develop themes, relate the themes to each other, relate them to previous literature. Also, sorry about that, there's a general flow in qualitative analysis. You formulate questions, identify issues to explore. Now that can range from very exploratory work where you're going to just get some general ideas and go from the data to the theory, as well as one where you're going to start with very specific hypotheses, very specific questions, and use that to structure your qualitative data. So that might structure your sampling with theoretical sampling. It would really structure your questions. Anyway, so irrespective, you then gather the data. As you gather the data, you analyze, you refine your questions, you identify new issues, you gather more data. You go back to analyzing, refining, and so on until you're sort of saturated, and then you say, you know what, I'm not learning anything new, I've got to stop. So again, coding is tagging using a system of categories, and coding doesn't have to do this, but it does enable sorting and counting quantitative data analysis, and it definitely enables organizing your data. When you do coding, you can have this inner coder reliability. In the next chapter, we're going to talk a lot more about reliability, but that just means to ones when the extent to which the codes are consistent between researchers, between coders. So where did the codes come from? Well, again, they can be developed deductively or inductively. You can really start with very well-developed hypotheses and theories and have your codes ready before you collect data. Or you cannot do that. You can just say, we're going to go out there, see what the data says to us, and develop the codes from that. Either way, as you do things, the codes can be renamed, clarified, collapsed, split apart, and reorganized as you learn. There is qualitative analysis software. It helps you store your qualitative data electronically, use keywords, create and modify the text, apply the codes to text, to images, and so on. Helps with multiple coders, retrieving segments, grouping, and so on. So the earliest qualitative data was this thing called in vivo, which is hard to use and has enormous capabilities. However, as everyday software has gotten much richer, a lot of people these days use Word and Excel. You can have text, tags, you can put comments, you can sort things. So if you're just getting started, or you have a small project, you probably don't need qualitative analysis software. And if you do, there are a whole bunch of newer ones that are easier to use than in vivo. That's probably good if you're going to become a really serious qualitative researcher doing a lot of it. So in some fields, they talk about a qualitative-quantitative quote-unquote debate and fight, and the researchers don't get along and don't think the other is valid. In applied research like public policy, health policy, criminal justice, things like that, there's a lot less of that. Nonetheless, there is a history. Social sciences started out as qualitative methods. And think about, the methods that are used in history, other humanities, international relations, and, sociology, and even once upon a time, economics to a certain extent. And, political science were qualitative. Then came the quantitative revolution decades ago, 50s, 60s, and more statistics and computing, and that became much bigger in quantitative research, certainly in economics, also in sociology, and in applied disciplines. And then there was a qualitative pushback about the limitations. My view, and the view in much qualitative research, is that they're complementary. The methods you use, qual or quant, and which kind of qualitative or quantitative, and whether you mix them, just depends on the research question and the stage of your research. Triangulation is a term you commonly hear that is often applied to mixed methods, but it's greater than that. How just getting multiple sources of evidence can converge on finding or confirming a theory. Also, qualitative and quantitative data and analysis are less different than people think. So one way to think of it is the way I've been formulating it now, which is in terms of the data. Qualitative data are texts, words, images, qualitative observations. Quantitative are numbers and categories. So that's the data, but then even within qualitative, you can analyze it in a qualitative way. That's box A, just interpreting it. But you can also analyze that qualitative data more quantitatively, turning them into numbers or categories. Nowadays, that's even bigger, and this has blurred because, as you probably know, there are all these bots, all these pieces of software that turn qualitative data, websites, people's answers on websites, all of that. They crawl the internet or in other ways, and they use algorithms to turn that qualitative data into quantitative. Counting things, categorizing, looking for patterns. Is that qualitative analysis or quantitative? Kind of blurring it. Data can be quantitative, like numbers and categories, and you can, of course, analyzing them using statistics, but as you learned in your statistics class, you then have to interpret that qualitatively. So you can have quantitative data that you interpret quantitatively. And even just the choice of statistics that you choose, those are driven by qualitative analysis too. Another thing I want to straighten out is that ideas or things you want to know about that people think about as qualitative can be measured quantitatively. And again, in the next chapter on measurement, we're going to be talking about that at length. But here the idea is you have something people think of as very qualitative, social support. And yet we have ways of finding indicators of things that give quantitative measures, numbers or categories about that. There's also a sort of cycle of research for quantitative and qualitative. That can be within a particular study, but it's also how a field and answering a particular research question evolve. They start with the more qualitative. Then they use that to develop theories and models and hypotheses, and they conduct surveys or they gather quantitative data off the web or with existing data, other ways we'll be talking about later in the semester. They then analyze that data and they get explanation. They revise their theories and so on, uncover causal mechanisms. They use that to gather new data, measure new variables, or do new analyses of existing data. Based on that, they get more explanation. So they go round and round like that. Finally, I want to talk briefly about ethics in qualitative research. As we said, in this course, we're going to integrate ethics into each substantive chapter. There are general principles like doing no harm and beneficence and getting informed consent, but these often take very different forms in different kinds of research. One big ethical issue in qualitative research is preserving confidentiality or anonymity, depending on what you've promised. If you have video, it's really hard to do that. Audio, still hard. Even text with quotes. If you've promised people that other people won't be able to, if you've promised the research subjects that people won't be able to identify who they are, how can you present what they've said to preserve that? You have to be very careful. Informed consent can be more complicated when you have this very open-ended, and that is especially true for this kind of observation and participant observation. Because of what the data you're getting is less predictable, you often uncover sensitive information. You need to plan for things like that. Prepare to give social service referrals. If people tell you about abuse that they've suffered in the course of your interview, you can't just leave them hanging, particularly if your interview prompted them to talk about that and they hadn't been before. So you need to be prepared to help people. Some people think that the nature of qualitative research should empower the research subjects. Some people think all research should empower subjects, but the sort of often more intimate nature does that. So, thank you for listening with qualitative research. We will do more quantitative research in this class, but a lot of the ideas will inform qualitative research, and it's, again, especially important when you do not know a lot. Don't go into writing a survey, for example, on something you don't already know a lot about, knowing a lot about the topic, knowing a lot about the population you want to survey. If you don't do that before you start to design your survey, you need to do a lot of qualitative research. Otherwise, you're probably going to ask the wrong questions and have the wrong response formats or so on. So this is an important tool. Thanks.